Good morning, and welcome to Global Perspectives, the program where we delve into today's most pressing international issues. Today, we are tackling a particularly challenging question. Should major sporting events like the Olympics or the World Cup be hosted by countries with documented poor human rights records? It's a topic that ignites passionate debate, balancing the unifying power of sport against deeply held ethical principles. With us to explore this are Dr. Ben Carter, a sports diplomat who believes in the power of engagement, and Sarah Chen, a human rights advocate with strong reservations. We will begin with opening statements, followed by 2 rounds of moderated discussion, and conclude with closing remarks from each of our guests.
Thank you, Alex. It's a privilege to discuss this significant matter. The concerns regarding human rights in sports are undeniably valid, and I acknowledge that. However, it is often suggested that isolating countries with problematic records is most effective. This is where I believe a different perspective is warranted. From my perspective, engagement, even with regimes whose practices are questionable, offers a more constructive path than outright boycotts. One could argue that the international scrutiny accompanying a major sporting event can act as a catalyst for improvements, however temporary. The global media spotlight can illuminate issues, forcing host nations to present a more acceptable face. Furthermore, sport possesses a unique capacity to build bridges and foster dialogue, where traditional diplomacy might fail. These events create platforms for cultural exchange, subtly contributing to greater understanding and potential long-term change. It's not about condoning abuses, but strategically using sport's universal appeal for cautious optimism and incremental progress. These events can open doors, rather than just legitimizing. The alternative, disengagement, often leads to these issues festering in the dark, without the leverage that global attention can provide. We need to weigh the potential for positive influence against the certainties of silence.
Thank you, Alex. While I appreciate Dr. Carter's viewpoint, I must respectfully disagree with its central premise. The main concern, from a human rights standpoint, is the profound ethical problem of awarding prestigious global events to nations that systematically violate their citizens' fundamental rights. It is unacceptable to allow sports glamour to overshadow such serious issues. These events are frequently exploited by host governments for, quote, sports washings. This involves using the positive image of hosting an international competition to distract from or legitimize a regime's abuses, effectively laundering its reputation without genuine reform. Evidence suggests that, far from leading to improvements, preparing for and hosting these events can worsen human rights violations. We often see crackdowns on dissent, forced evictions for infrastructure, and exploitation of labor, all for a flawless spectacle. Consider activists and journalists. They often face increased suppression as the state aims to present a perfect image. The message sent is that human rights are secondary to entertainment and profit. This is not engagement. It's complicity. Therefore, conferring the honor of hosting upon these nations is not a tool for change, but a betrayal of the values international sport should uphold. We must prioritize principles.
Thank you both for those compelling opening statements. Dr. Carter, Sarah Chen has forcefully raised the issue of, quote, sports washing. How do you respond to the concern that these events primarily serve to legitimize regimes and burnish their international image, without leading to any genuine, sustainable reform in human rights?
That's a very fair and critical question, Alex. The risk of sports washing is real, and it's something that sporting bodies and international observers must be vigilant about. However, I would argue that boycotts and complete isolation are often ineffective, sometimes even counterproductive. When we refuse to engage, we lose any potential leverage or opportunity for dialogue, however difficult that dialogue might be. These events, if managed with a clear human rights agenda by international federations, can provide a specific time frame and context to press for certain commitments or to monitor situations closely. For instance, conditions attached to hosting bids could include specific human rights benchmarks or allowing greater access for international NGOs. It's about finding ways to make engagement meaningful, rather than assuming all engagement is a tacit endorsement.
Ms. Chen, Dr. Carter suggests that engagement, perhaps with conditions attached, can bring valuable scrutiny and potential leverage. Do you see any circumstances where hosting a major sporting event in a country with a poor human rights record could genuinely be beneficial? Or is the inherent risk of legitimization and sports washing always too high to justify it?
While I understand Dr. Carter's desire for constructive engagement, I remain deeply skeptical about its efficacy in these contexts. The primary effect we observe, time and again, is indeed legitimization. Any scrutiny that does occur is often superficial, carefully managed, and stage-managed by the host nation. Access for independent monitors is frequently restricted, and critical voices are silenced well in advance of the event. The promises of reform or improved conditions made during bidding processes often evaporate once the television cameras depart. We've seen host nations make cosmetic changes or temporary concessions that do not translate into systemic long-term improvements for their citizens. The leverage Dr. Carter speaks of is, in practice, very limited when up against a state determined to control its image.
Let's shift the focus slightly. Dr. Carter, what about the athletes themselves? Should they be expected, or even asked, to compete in environments where significant human rights violations are known to occur? Is it fair to place them in such a potentially compromising position?
That's another crucial dimension to this debate, Alex. Athletes dedicate their lives to their sport, and for many, participating in an Olympics or a World Cup is the pinnacle of their career. Boycotts, more often than not, end up punishing these individuals, who usually have very little say in where events are held. Furthermore, athletes are not a monolithic group. Some may feel uncomfortable, while others might see an opportunity, however small, to act as ambassadors for positive values, perhaps through subtle gestures, or by engaging with local communities if permitted. It's also worth noting that many athletes compete in numerous countries with varying political systems throughout their careers. Singling out specific major events for boycotts can seem inconsistent and disproportionately impacts those whose competitive window is short.
Ms. Chen, if awarding major sporting events to these countries is not the answer, what alternative actions do you believe international sporting bodies, or indeed the international community, should take to promote human rights in these nations, rather than, as you've argued, rewarding them with prestigious global showcases?
That's a constructive question, Alex. There are indeed more ethical and effective strategies. Firstly, international sporting federations must implement and rigorously enforce far stricter human rights criteria as a non-negotiable part of the bidding and hosting process. This includes independent assessments and clear consequences for non-compliance. Secondly, instead of pouring billions into mega-events that often benefit autocratic regimes, resources could be redirected to support grassroots sports initiatives within those countries, programs that genuinely empower local communities and promote inclusivity without the state propaganda. Finally, continuous diplomatic pressure, targeted sanctions where appropriate, and robust support for human rights defenders and civil society organizations within these nations are far more direct and principled ways to foster change than legitimizing regimes through high-profile sporting spectacles.
Thank you, Alex and Ms. Chen, for this robust discussion. In conclusion, while the challenges and ethical dilemmas associated with hosting major sporting events in countries with questionable human rights records are undeniably significant, I maintain that engagement, approached thoughtfully and strategically, offers more potential for positive long-term influence than isolation. The concerns raised about sports washing are valid, and vigilance is paramount. However, we should not underestimate the unique power of sport to open doors, to foster people-to-people connections, and to bring a level of international attention that can, at times, provide leverage for dialogue and incremental change. Boycotts often harm athletes most directly and can lead to missed opportunities for subtle diplomacy and cultural exchange. The spotlight of a global event, if coupled with clear expectations and monitoring from international sporting bodies, can create pressure points and highlight areas for improvement even if progress is slow and imperfect. We should strive for a nuanced approach, one that doesn't shy away from difficult contexts, but instead seeks to use the platforms available, including sport, to encourage greater openness and respect for universal values. It is about finding a balance between principled stands and pragmatic engagement, always aiming to keep channels of communication open, rather than retreating into silence, which ultimately serves no one's long-term interests.
Thank you, Alex. To sum up, while I acknowledge Dr. Carter's arguments for engagement, I must reiterate that the ethical unacceptability of rewarding countries with dire human rights records with the prestige of hosting major sporting events is profound. The practice of sports washing is not a mere side effect. It is often a primary strategic goal for these regimes, and we must not be complicit. The negative impact on human rights defenders, journalists, and marginalized communities within these nations during the lead-up to and during these events is well documented. Any supposed scrutiny is often a carefully managed illusion, while the reality is one of increased repression to project an image of stability and modernity. It is imperative that international sporting organizations, and indeed the global community, prioritize fundamental human rights principles above profit, spectacle, or perceived diplomatic expediency. The values of fair play, respect, and human dignity, which sport purports to champion, should be non-negotiable. The international community must not turn a blind eye to systematic abuses for the sake of a few weeks of entertainment. Instead, we must insist on tangible, verifiable, and sustainable human rights improvements as a prerequisite for hosting. Anything less is an abdication of our moral responsibility and a betrayal of those suffering under oppression.
Dr. Carter, Ms. Chen, thank you both for sharing your deeply considered perspectives and for such an insightful and respectful debate today. You've given us a great deal to reflect upon. We've heard compelling arguments for engagement and the potential of sport as a bridge, alongside stark warnings about sports washing and the imperative to uphold human rights principles. It's clear that there are no easy answers to this complex issue, balancing the ideals of global sport with the realities of international politics and human rights. We encourage our audience to continue thinking about the multifaceted questions raised today. Thank you for joining us on Global Perspective.